Hey, good morning. I'm Michael Fisher here. Another video. I want to cover what's happening in the presidency in America right now. Marianne Williamson, for example, is one of the Democrat candidates running, and she's somebody who interests me from going back a way long way in my history. And I want to talk a little bit about that and how she's come up through the years. Since the early 90s, when I started paying attention to Marianne Williamson as a serious um, liberator and leader and someone who has a vision and is not willing to be a small person. So congratulations to Marianne Williamson right off the top, and that'll be an interesting part mostly of this video. I also want to just briefly go over some of the last video, which was the incident of the young Catholic teenage boy who confronted and was confronted by an interesting dynamic of relationship between an Indigenous elder in Washington during protests, and that's in my last video, When Fear Meets Fearlessness, one of my favorite topics. And I also had an interview with Kevin Barrett after that video that I put up, and that was on his radio, Jihad radio show program. He's an Islamist and a very well-known dissident and interesting academic, and has a lot of guests on his program. I'll put a link below. And just to say thank you, Kevin Barrett, for interviewing me on some of the dynamics of fear and fearlessness in that interaction. So you can go there and listen to that interview if you want more. Just again, as kind of a little bit of house cleaning on that last video, several people liked the video that I produced and my interpretation, including Kevin Barrett, enjoyed the interpretation I had. He thought it was, in a sense, not going left or right and typical kind of who did what and who should be blamed for what and who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. So I was really working at trying to get to a higher level of moral discourse and educative discourse than trying to figure all those fine details out. But it was amazing to watch how many people would continually challenge me on, yeah, but did you watch this? And you don't have all the information. And so they were still caught on this really behavior, what actually happened. And my experience as both a therapist and as an emancipatory educator is all those fine details of who did what and who, they're very limited in what they can actually produce as really interesting and transformative outcomes. So just to keep that in mind, I don't operate, just like I said in one of my videos, I'm not a big statistic and fact fan. And my investigations are much more on broad pattern matching and pattern connecting for the purpose of a higher connection. I know it sounds kind of weird saying that, but really it's where I've always found the best results, and people have told me those are the best results because they say, wow, Dr. Fisher, you think in ways that other people don't think. So getting out of that really literal behavioral level of analysis of an event like that one that I'm speaking about in Washington is really important. And I'll try to do the same to try and interpret Marianne Williamson's current campaign and some of the very interesting things she was saying, provocative and also very sincere, but I will try to put my own spin on those and see how you think of the interpretation. Look forward to your feedback on that. The last bit of feedback I got on the last video, very interesting again to watch, what attracts people's attention. And I don't know, there was at least 5 people that said, and kill the sunglasses. What's the sunglasses for? Get rid of those, or just it was disturbing to them. I can't see your eyes, so how do I know? And some person got quite nasty about it in the comments on that video. You can check all that out if you want. But point being, I wanted to let you know is that I'm a very serious person. Obviously, I focus every day, every morning. You can see the office behind me, my works that I've carried for the last 30 years of serious investigation about the nature of fear and fearlessness and how that is actually influencing the future of humanity and has shaped and influenced us, and that we can actually learn to work with that knowledge of fear and fearlessness in a much better way. And that's something Marianne Williamson is beginning to touch on. And in why fear is so important in her campaign. Get to that in a moment. So people didn't like the sunglasses, and my argument is that's because you don't understand how playful I am. I'm equally serious and equally playful. I am, quote, sometimes a sacred warrior and a trickster. I use those archetypes, and those are meant to disrupt ordinary signals and communication patterns. And also, I love the sunglasses as a part of a grieving message. Often you'll see presidents' wives, if they have someone assassinated, wear sunglasses, for example. I remember Jackie Kennedy really influenced me way back in the unfortunate death of John F. Kennedy in an assassination. And I play with all these kinds of cues and signals and historical events. When I dress up to do a video, I'm not dressed up today. I don't have a particular costume, and this is what I wear every day, so you get to see the raw. So keep that in mind. I'm a performance artist, and I've done many performances in stage and theater and my own. I'm not famous or anything, and I don't do it as a serious hobby. But as an artist, I do performance art as well as visual art and poetic art and all kinds of arts. I want to start with the quote this morning just before I dive into Marianne Williamson, I think some background on Fearlessness Movement, because that's really what I'm into. Remember writing this publication, Do We Really Want a Fearless Society, back in 2012. I've also written something much earlier than that, back in the early 2000s, and that's my serious work. Do we really want a fearless society, and how would we get there? Well, here's a quote from someone I really respect, and I'm going to kind of focus on women leaders today. I think women leaders, there's my heater, I'll just turn that off. Women leaders are really important, I think, in this movement, the Fearlessness Movement, which I've coined as a historical movement. But just let me start with something. Margaret Wheatley, an organizational development consultant, kind of a guru in the business management coaching area, executive coaching from the Bricana Institute. She was president and started in 1992. So she's been around, and she's been in a lot of organizations, dealt with a lot of different business people and leaders. And I find her work on fear and fearlessness very important. So I highly recommend I'll put her name down and again below this video. But she challenged some people in a talk in 2006 at the Shambhala Institute in Nova Scotia, and she had these leaders in the room, and this is what she said. Love this question. Are we choosing names for ourselves that demand fearlessness? You're a coach, perhaps. You're an executive, perhaps a consultant, a teacher, a minister. Maybe you're a hospital administrator. Maybe you're a civil servant. Are those names demanding fearlessness of us as leaders in the future? I don't know what would create fearlessness per se, but I think this is a very important question. Yeah, and that is a very important question. Thank you for asking that, Margaret Wheatley. I end my book where I just took that quote from, World's Fearlessness Teachings, big book, which I've mentioned before. I end it with what she called 8 Fearless Questions, which came out in a later publication after she gave that talk. And her point was really trying to raise the bar for leaders. And this is really related to Marianne Williamson. She's really raising the bar for leaders in terms of ethical, moral, emotional, affective development, compassion development, but focusing on fear and fearlessness. So here's Margaret Wheatley, 8 questions that she poses to all leaders, which I highly recommend we consider. First one, does the world need us to be fearless? What if we can save the world? What if we can't save the world? Even better. What if it likes to live in the future now? What is it like to live in the future now? Why do we imprison ourselves? Why are we so afraid? Can we work beyond hope and fear? Love that question. What would it take for us to just deal with what is? And the 8th one, what would it take to not need to be always engaged in changing the world, not making everything a problem. And I've said this in some other videos, is I often talk about the fear problem, and I define it obviously way more largely than most people do, more in depth. And there's a tendency to then, every time fear comes up as a concept or something to study, as in fear studies, the tendency is to always put it into a problematic frame. Oh, there's a problem, there's a problem. And I basically say, no, that actually can be a fault. And she actually, Margaret Wheatley, picks up that that can be a fault as well. Because you want to be playful. You don't want to put everything into a problem that you start and encapsulate and control the meaning of what your investigation is by creating this crisis problem. And so that's kind of crisis research, that's crisis management. And there's so much of that in leadership today, managing from, short-term here crisis to there, and plugging the holes and not getting to the deeper solutions and analysis. And that's where I'll start with Marianne. Marianne Williamson, a little bit about her. Back in 1993, I was running the In Search of Fearlessness Institute and community at that time in Calgary, Alberta, and came across some books. Somebody from the New Age community said, "Oh, you got to read Marianne." And I said, "Okay, well, why?" And she says, "Well, she talks about fear." Well, not just she doesn't talk about fear. The whole A Course in Miracles talks about fear. And I started to investigate Course in Miracles. Well, that's not exactly my kind of ordinary language or even interest. But with investigation, started to find out there was a whole movement around the world, started in America. You can look up the history on that in the 70s of a kind of channel discourse and esoteric philosophy of love and fear. And there's a whole book. It's like their Bible, A Course in Miracles Bible in a sense. And that attracted a whole lot of people because you didn't have to be part of a religion, even though it's got parts of Hinduism and Vedic philosophy. It's part Christian. It's got some Buddhism in it. It's a real mixture of an interesting text, absolutely, and an emancipatory text that's trying to free humans from living in a fear-based way. So that's exciting, and love was basically the answer to everything, more or less. And so that book I've analyzed over the years and criticized as its approach. I'm not convinced that love is going to be the answer per se, and we have to nuance that. So I'm going to read another little piece from On Love and Fear, my view, from this book, produced in 2016 with Dish Suba. And this is a little bit of history about me and why I care about and the kind of language that I use. And sorry, this might be a little technical, but I think it just gives a feel for where I come from. So about 5 minutes here on a little read, and then we'll jump into Marianne's work. Although In Search of Fearlessness Project 1989, in coming on its 18th birthday, I wrote this in 2007, it has always been important to locate this project, Search of Fearlessness, as a new social movement. And I've called that later the Fearlessness Movement, and that's the term it has now. With an ancient rooted past in a concrete history of liberation movements, East and West, North and South. This paper provides an introduction to several exciting discoveries and initiatives that have led to clarifying both the importance of this historical ground consciousness for the Fearlessness Movement and the In Search of Fearlessness Project, my original term, and clarifying the future possibilities for researching and writing a history of fearlessness. You know what, folks? The ancient roots of this perennial ethical philosophy, which posits that love is greater than fear, and the path and virtue of fearlessness, example in the Bhagavad Gita, is the way from fear to love, violence to nonviolence, ahimsa, is indicative of the Fearlessness Movement's foundational philosophy, theory, and practice of fearlessness, also defined as a basis for compassion. In general, the philosophy of fearlessness, my specialty, is more accepted by Eastern religions and philosophies than the Western. According to Fisher's unique research synthesis of the fearlessness movement and its base in the world's fearlessness tradition and teachings, he posits premises of a critical and radical philosophy of nonviolence and liberation. Thus, a theory of fearlessness is required, and a paradigm of fearlessness of how to operate in general is important and essential to the future. He also distinguishes the fearlessness movement sometimes as a historical fearlessness. So this was in distinction from behavioral fearlessness. Often most people, when they use the word fearlessness, right, they want to immediately think, well, what kind of behaviors, characteristics does that have? And I say, well, that's working only on a very literal and concrete and behavioral aspect of fearlessness. We need a large imaginary based on a historical fearlessness or an ethical fearlessness that I find within history in itself. Although no one has ever written a history of fearlessness. We have histories of fear written and published, several of them today. Very interesting, but why not a history of fearlessness? Well, here's why not. In 2000, Fisher makes a connection of nonviolence movements and fearlessness movement toward a fearless society, one that has inspired many leaders, of which Mahatma Gandhi and his Satyagraha movement, independence movement, was foremost in its clear conception of the pivotal role of fearlessness. Gandhi once said, quote, "God is fearlessness," end quote. His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, once said to Westerners, quote, "Don't fear fearlessness," end quote. And that was during one of his talks in the early 2000s. He was traveling around and repeated that phrase, don't fear fearlessness. And I say in the West, that's exactly what we have primarily. In the East, they're much more familiar and more comfortable to some degree with the notion of a gift of fearlessness, Abhaya Dana, the tradition of gifting via fearlessness to not create a fear-based society. In 2000, Fisher wrote, "As an educator, I am interested to challenge our ways of understanding and defining violence, and the ways that we think are best to deal with violence in all kinds of formal and informal learning sites." This publication in 2000 is intended to briefly document a growing populist and academic movement that suggests that a nonviolent society can only be founded on fearlessness. The ethical path of a fearless life is a way of love. The way to love, I argue, and this fearlessness movement suggests, is to better understand the nature and role of fear and its impact on this planet. And I also use fear with the fear marks, which have complicated that understanding of fear. How does one join and carry on the mission of the fearlessness movement? Well, there is no membership per se, and there is many ways to do that, and many ways that we don't even know yet. We haven't even invented how to figure out all the ways and or studied fear and fearlessness enough in the systematic way that I'm talking about today and that I try to do in my work. Well, why would we want to do all that work, and why is it connected to Marianne Williamson? So here's the feature for today's video. I will be as brief as I can because I know it's a long topic to discuss Marianne Williamson's work and the Course in Miracles and her presidential candidacy. So she stepped up. She doesn't believe in being small, and one of her famous quotes came out of the early 90s. This was when Nelson Mandela in Africa, who became a world leader on a very ethical, important world leader, and I believe a leader of the fearlessness movement indirectly. He didn't use those words because in his speech, he used Marianne Williamson's quote from one of her books. And some have even said that Marianne Williamson in the back in those times when Nelson Mandela was released, actually wrote part of his speech. This is no small event in history, and here's what Nelson Mandela read in his inaugural speech. "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. And he went on and on. I'm just an excerpt from that speech. So here was a speech by his president who had been imprisoned as a dissident in his own country, South Africa, and came out with this amazing declaration where he put fear right at the top. And I found other quotes over the years that Nelson Mandela has written about. And there's a great movie on him. He was a sacred warrior. He was a tribal warrior and came from a very sacred tradition, and he knew. And this is what's exciting. He knew the role that fear plays and how important it is to move beyond. He said, along with Marianne Williamson's wisdom, the deepest fear is actually of our greatness, of our spiritual base, is what they were really talking about, our transpersonal aspect, not the fear of death. That's a very egoic conceptualization of the fear, patternings that control us. But when you start to look at the fear that we've been taught and inbred, it's been inculcated in us to fear our greater spiritual connection. And go back to Gandhi, God is fearlessness. We are fearlessness in spirit. We are the spirit of fearlessness. Is something that I argue in my work. Okay, so that just gives you a little bit of philosophical interest, why there's been a resistance to that, where we fear fearlessness. And many great leaders have known this, and a lot of them we don't know exactly what their views were on fear and fearlessness, but we know some. And so Nelson Mandela, and now Marianne Williamson running for the 2020 election in the US. Marianne Williamson on her website uses this term, heal the soul of America. This is on her presidential website. It's right there in a little badge. So anyone who's talking about the soul, you see we're now talking about the soul's journey. So Marianne Williamson is not talking about all, she will mention the problems, the issues. You have to be a political candidate today. You have to talk about issues, education, social networks, and economy, and employment, international relations. But she is no way, and she says this really bluntly, I'm not here to try to win votes by saying the right things. We've had enough leaders do that. We've had enough of that in American politics, and that is not the core soul of America. So she's quite American in that way. She's a bit kind of conservative nationalist in a certain way, but she's got this transcendent, transpersonal perspective. And when she says, I'm a serious player here, and I'm going to talk about the issues of the truth. I'm going to speak what is in my heart, and if the American people like it, go for it. You want to vote for me? I'll be there. I'll lead. But we're going to do this together. I'm not going to be the typical male leader that's going to go in and rescue in Washington. No, that'll never work. So she's after a movement. She's after what I would call a fearlessness movement. She is part of the fearlessness movement that goes back in tradition, as I say, to the Course of Miracles, part of the fearlessness movement. Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma, another leader in the fearlessness movement. There's, of course, Gandhi, who talked about fearlessness all the time in his nonviolence movement. Martin Luther King, we could go on to others. And so the fearlessness movement is also in my work an attempt to create a bigger movement of what she calls the higher consciousness. She says on her website campaign, we have a problem with the psychological fabric of our country as a low-level emotional civil war. It has begun to tear apart in many ways the society. I have never heard a candidate ever in any country, nation, great leader say, we have a problem and it's an emotional civil war. Another term for that in America would be culture wars. That's the common analysis that many use. I've used the term fear wars in this culture wars of right versus left, secular versus religious, white versus black. We could go on and on with this divisiveness. And underneath it, I call it a fear war is going on. One side trying to use fear to manipulate the other's trying to use fear to manipulate the other, the fearsome ruling the fearful. And that last binary is B. Maria Kumar writing a book on India, a nation of fear and prejudice, and I'm writing the second part of that book with him, and Desh Suba, the third part of that book, on us doing a fear analysis of India and its history. And Kumar, who lives in India, a retired police officer and leader of the police force in Bhopal, has started this initiative. So he's another leader on the Fearlessness Movement who he sees the real importance. We have to talk about fear and fearlessness in these developing countries and in the developed countries. As Marianne Williamson says, we haven't done a great job with fear. We've perpetuated it into this emotional civil war. Now, if you look underneath Marianne Williamson's background, when I first met her, she's always was talking about fear and love. These are the two great binaries, that you either make choices in love or you make choices that move you toward fear. And that is found in the perennial wisdom literatures around the world. In my research, I've found that in most traditions, spiritual, secular, philosophical, of anything of great ethical import to human history and the future. So we have to figure that out. Why do we move? As she says, why do we move toward this fear-based world view and then act out of that perception, which is a world we can't trust. And there's good reasons we can't trust. We're very wounded by the world. And we have not had a healing culture, which I've said in many of my others. So I've just started a program called LET, which is something about, I can't even remember the name right now, life enhancement training. And I'm taking that into the communities in Calgary. I've created a video. I'll eventually put that up on my website and YouTube to help communities regain the basics of a culture of fearlessness, which is related to a healing culture. And that has a strong feminine, female, womanist perspective with it, because of the very unique way that women come into the world and give in a gifting way, in a sense, a gift of fearlessness to their children as best they can under the conditions. And of course, it's never perfect. But that is going to be a new leadership led by a healing culture, which is what Marianne Williamson is doing. It's going to be a culture that she calls love. So her answer is love, and that she wants to build a culture of love back in American fabric, and that's essential to our social unity. Great mission. And again, one could go into great details about how she's planning to do that. So very briefly, why do I critique at times, and I would like to help this movement that Marianne is about. I've been working on it for 30 years. I have a few things to say about it. If you remember in that reading from my book, I said, this is serving love. This is the servancy of the gift and the gift economy, the sacred economy of the woman, mother, the basic mother-child bonding, the matrixio, as Bracha Ettinger would say in her work. Very important theorist on a new view of the matrixio sphere compared to, in contrast to Freud and Lacan and the other psychoanalysts. Bracha is also an artist and really understands the creation process and this intimacy that's so important in human relations. I won't go into that here. But to say that there's a new non-fear-based way of understanding ourself, our identities, our realities, and fear is now the common principle on both sides of the fence of our politics, and that's what Marianne Williamson's picking up. Okay, let's acknowledge it, folks. That's what she's saying. Let's acknowledge that we're both operating on the progressives and the conservatives. It's the base of fear, is the base of the major oppressions: ageism, classism, sexism, racism. We have a foundation to work. And Marianne Williamson says, I'm not going to try to win your votes on popular opinions. I'm going to speak from my heart, and I know that this is the right way to go for us. So I'm very curious to see how she does that, and what I argue, why I don't put love as the answer and is the forefront. Love is the foundation in my work. But the path is from fear-based, along this path of fearlessness. And that's the education that we've not well had. We've often been told, if you're in fear-based, you need to get over to be loving-based and be like the great spiritual leaders, whether it's Buddha or Christ or Muhammad or whoever, the great spiritual symbol of love. But it's done through a type of moralism. We just need to get from there to there, right? And okay, you need to get through your process of cleansing yourself and have practices that move you along to become loved. And my argument has always been is that love's a bit distracting. There's a lot of reasons love is so fraught with so many really distortive and exaggerative and popularized and commercialized notions that I've said, let's just keep love in the background. Yes, that's where we're going. That's the rule of love, the queendom of love that we're all trying to get to, if in an ideal society, a fearless society. But you see, that's what I would prefer to talk to and talk about, is that we need to learn these steps in this education from fear along the path of fearlessness to love. I think that's really the most important thing I wanted to conclude with. I'm excited about possible connections and conversations that can come on this topic, that study fear. That's my suggestion. And study it in all its nuancing so that we become experts, connoisseurs of fears, or as my colleague would say. And that's going to continually emerge more love, more healing, more emancipation, more compassion. And that's just my strategy. We obviously need many strategies. Marianne Williamson and the Course in Miracles that she follows as her basic philosophy has its approach. And let's bring them together. Let's study the fearlessness movements throughout history. Let's study how Nelson Mandela did an amazing work in South Africa, how Gandhi did his amazing work as a world leader, and Marianne Williamson and new leaders coming up can look at all of these perspectives, including this feminist, feminine, womanist, matrixio, gift of fearlessness traditions that come out of East Asia, the Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism traditions, which I've studied and written about. So many things. I hope this video has been a little bit exciting for you to think about. Maybe it's not so weird. Here we have somebody running for president, and I think she's going to probably do a pretty good run, and it's not about winning, but she's actually lecturing and talking and sharing this with so many people because she's in the media on a big scale. And I just would ask her and her team to reflect and discover and take in other ideas about how to move from fear to love. Not just their way, not just the Course in Miracle way. There are many traditions, and the Fearlessness Movement is, as far as I know, the strongest traditions to feed into the wisdom and knowledge and education required to accomplish the same goal, Marianne. Accomplish the same goal as the great leaders wanted. And yes, there will be resistance. So I could do a whole other video on the resistances too. I'll save that, but just to let you know, there's a publication you can look at, Defining the Enemy of Fearlessness. In 1997, I wrote this paper because can't be naive about it, and Marianne Williamson is not naive, that There are great forces, as she says, out to destroy her work, her teaching, her leadership, and out to destroy love. Unfortunately, she uses a term that many are using, which is the sociopathic. She says there's many sociopathic leaders. There's a sociopathic economy. I'm quoting her in her speech for the 2020 presidency. And that would be a whole really interesting video to come to. Maybe I'll do in a week or two down the road of, is it actually valuable to use those kinds of large labels for sociopathic corporations, sociopathic leaders, sociopathic anything, and how it's being used. So taking a clinical term, and they're now using it, many people, different people I've seen, with good intention, in a criticism, in a way to critique. And I'm going like, how is that actually going to be effective when those people that you're critiquing as sociopaths have huge power, and you're using that language, and do you think that's actually useful? Let's ask that question later from a point of view of fearlessness. Okay, thanks for tuning in.